The white SUV crossed my cattle guard without stopping. It parked on my grass. 4 doors opened. I was walking my fence line when they started zip-tying signs to my posts. HOA easement road, no interference. Bold, laminated. On my property by people who had not asked. The woman in front had a lanyard and a clipboard. She turned to face me before I reached her.
Mr. Nam, you are hereby served. You do not own this road. You will not interfere with HOA access in any way, or we will have you removed.
A 4th person held out an envelope. I took it. I didn't say anything. I remember thinking she had no idea what was already sitting in the glove box of my truck. I read the cover page. The phrase, established easement rights, sat in the first paragraph like a claim written in permanent ink. I kept reading. She was still talking.
We have been using this road for 31 years. That establishes our legal rights. Buying the land next to an HOA does not mean you own our infrastructure.
She said it with the complete confidence of someone who has never needed to be right in any formal or legally verifiable way, only certain. That quality of certainty has a particular sound to it. You learn to recognize when someone has confused long habit with legal standing. I looked up from the envelope. She was already turning back toward the SUV. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment because it matters to how the rest of this played out. It wasn't rage, it wasn't surprise. It was something closer to recognition, the still cold kind you get when something you've been expecting finally arrives right on schedule. Here's the full picture. I had bought this land 11 months earlier, 1,200 acres of former farmland at the southwest edge of a growing suburb fields. Woodlot, an old equipment track, and 1 paved access road that cut through the corner of my parcel and connected the Cedarwood Ridge subdivision to the county highway. 96 homes. 1 road. Every family in that development drove across my property line twice a day without knowing it. My attorney had flagged it at closing. He pulled the plat map, traced the boundary lines, and said the words I'd carried with me ever since: the road is there, the use is there, the legal right, I'm not seeing it. I had spent the 3 weeks after closing going through every document I could find, every deed in the chain, every county plat back to 1971, every survey, every tax record, every instrument recorded or conspicuously absent from the record. What I found, and what Margaret had apparently never looked for, is that using a road for 30 years does not automatically become a legal right to that road. Use and right are 2 different things. Most people only learn that distinction when it costs them something. I looked past her toward my truck parked up the slope near the tree line. In the glove box was a county plat map, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. I knew every line on it. I knew exactly where the Cedarwood Ridge boundary ended. I knew where the road sat, and I knew whose parcel it ran through. They had just served me a lawsuit that would force every document about that road into open court, in front of a judge, on the public record. They had just built me a stage. They had handed me exactly what I needed. Margaret. I would learn her full name and 11 years of board history within the hour, walked back to the white SUV without another glance in my direction. The process server gave a professional nod and followed. The 2 men finished the last sign and climbed in after them. The SUV reversed back through my cattle guard and turned onto the county road. I stood in the grass and looked at what they'd left behind. 3 signs, my fence posts, my land. I took out my phone and photographed every one of them. Then the tire tracks in the grass where their vehicle had crossed my property line without permission. Then the posts themselves, their condition, their placement, the angle of each sign. Dated and time-stamped 1 frame after the next. I've been told I have a methodical streak. My land attorney calls it a gift. I think of it as something simpler when people show you what they're willing to do. You write it down. I walked back to the truck, got in and pulled the plat map from the glove box, unfolded it across the steering wheel, found the southwest corner of my parcel, found the road corridor, found the HOA subdivision boundary sitting clearly to the east 60 feet from the road's center line at minimum. No easement notation, no right-of-way, no recorded instrument of any kind giving Cedarwood Ridge a legal claim to that strip of pavement. There never had been. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known because they had never once bothered to check, was that I had spent 3 weeks going through every deed, every survey, and every county record tied to this land. Every transaction going back to 1971, every signature, every notation, every deliberate absence of notation. And nowhere, not on a single page, was there a valid easement for that road. I spent 14 months looking for this land. Not this specific parcel, I didn't know it existed until month 13, but the category of land it represented. Something large enough to work seriously. Something with existing infrastructure access. Something adjacent to a growing area without being consumed by it. What I found was a 1,200-acre farm estate at the southwest edge of a county that had been quietly urbanizing for 2 decades. 3 generations of one family had worked it. When the last of them passed without direct heirs, the estate went to auction. I was the 3rd bidder. I was also the most prepared. The parcel had everything I'd been looking for: open fields, a woodlot, a service track on the northern end, and running through the southwest corner, a paved road. Narrow but solid. Well maintained, as it turned out, because 96 families on the other side of it had a strong personal interest in keeping it that way. That road connected Cedarwood Ridge subdivision to the county highway. It had done so for 31 years, and for 31 years everyone involved had simply assumed the arrangement was legal. I understand why that sounds implausible. You'd think someone would have checked. But consider most people don't pull a plat map on a road they've been driving since before their kids were born. Roads feel permanent. Permanent things feel legal. That chain of feeling is where HOAs make very expensive mistakes. The road had been county maintained until 1989. When Cedarwood Ridge formed the county, handed maintenance to the new HOA, and walked away. No easement recorded, no right-of-way filed, no notation on any plat. The HOA paid to repave it every few years, and somewhere in that process concluded that maintaining a road was the same as owning a legal claim to it. 96 families drove it every single day without knowing that distinction had never been tested. Margaret had been board president for 11 of those 31 years. In that time, she had built something that functioned less like a homeowners association and more like a small private government with fines as its primary currency of control. $50 for grass over 4 inches. $200 for a paint color the board hadn't pre-approved. $500 for what the notices called non-compliant vehicles in driveway, which in practice meant anything Margaret personally found disagreeable on her morning walks. 3 liens filed against homeowners in the last 5 years. 2 families had sold and left rather than keep fighting. One couple, the Hendersons, both in their 70s, fixed income, carried a $1,400 cumulative fine balance accumulated over 3 years of minor subjective violations. Grass height, a seasonal wreath left on the door past a date the HOA had apparently decreed. I didn't know any of this on the day I was served. I learned it piece by piece over the weeks that followed, mostly from neighbors who reached out to me, not the other way around. But I'm getting ahead of the story. When Margaret found out that 1,200 acres adjacent to her subdivision had sold at auction to a single private buyer, she made a decision. She didn't call me, didn't knock on my gate, didn't ask what I intended to do with the land or whether I had any awareness of the road running through my southwest corner. She filed a preemptive lawsuit. The logic I eventually understood was this: a landowner that size adjacent to the subdivision represented a variable she couldn't control. People who buy large parcels near suburbs don't always share HOA sensibilities about who uses what and on whose authority. She decided to establish the road claim on paper before I could question it. She moved fast. She moved with complete confidence. She did not move carefully. I would later obtain the board meeting minutes from 2003, the year Margaret's predecessor formally voted to assert control over the road. No attorney consulted, no county approval sought, no title review ordered, just a motion, a second, and 3 people in a conference room deciding they owned something they'd never verified. What she never did, what apparently no one on the Cedarwood Ridge board had done in 31 years of using that road, was pull the original 1971 county plat. My closing attorney did it as a matter of course. Standard title work. You trace the boundary lines, look for easement notations, dedications, right-of-way instruments, any recorded document establishing a legal right to use someone else's land. You expect to find something. You look until you're certain. He called me the afternoon before I signed the final papers. I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot of his office. The road's there, he said. The use is there. A pause. The legal right, I'm not seeing it. I asked him to look again. Same result. I closed on the land the next morning. I did not contact Margaret, did not send a letter to the HOA board, did not put anyone on notice that anything was unusual about the situation. I came home, spread the plat map across the kitchen table, and sat with it for a while. Then I folded it up, put it in the glove box of my truck, and got back to work. I didn't have to wait long. The cease and desist arrived 2 weeks after the lawsuit. It was a well-formatted letter. 4 pages, professional letterhead, the kind of document that costs a homeowners association between $800 and $1,200 to produce. I know that range because I asked. The letter ordered me not to obstruct, gate alter, or threaten access to the road running through my southwest corridor. It described my purchase of the 1,200-acre parcel as a threat to the community's established way of life. It requested that I acknowledge in writing Cedarwood Ridge HOA's right to the road in perpetuity. And then buried in the third page was the phrase their attorney had built their entire case around. Prescriptive easement by continuous open and hostile use. I wrote it down. Not because I didn't understand it, because I wanted it on paper in my own handwriting where I could look at it. I forwarded the letter to my land attorney that afternoon. He called me back within the hour. "You see the word hostile," he said. "I see it." "Good." A pause. "Don't touch the road." I hadn't touched the road, hadn't gated it, hadn't placed a single obstacle or sign or marker anywhere near it. The road was exactly as it had been the day I closed on the parcel. Every Cedarwood Ridge resident had driven it without interruption every single morning since the lawsuit was filed. I noted that too. While I was doing nothing, Margaret was not. She called an emergency homeowners meeting. From what I was told later, she stood at the front of the community room and described me as an outside land speculator who had purchased adjacent property with the specific intention of threatening their road access. She said I was the kind of buyer who buys land to leverage it against people. She said the board was protecting the community from someone who didn't share their values or their investment in Cedarwood Ridge. She said all of this before I had done a single thing. That's how you build a siege mentality. You make the threat large and urgent before anyone has had time to verify whether it's real. I've seen it work. It's effective in the short term on people who are already afraid. 96 families use that road twice a day. Margaret knew exactly how much fear that number could hold. My phone rang 3 days after the community meeting, number I didn't recognize. I answered. "This is Carl Reeves. I've lived in Cedarwood Ridge for 19 years. I was at the meeting last night." A brief silence. "She's telling people you're going to gate off the road and charge them to use it." "I haven't touched the road," I said. "I know." Another pause. "I looked you up. Figured I should call." Carl was a retired civil engineer. He had moved into Cedarwood Ridge before Margaret joined the board, before the fine structure grew teeth back, when the HOA had functioned more or less the way HOAs are supposed to function. He had watched it change. He had a manila folder's worth of things he'd been quietly saving over the years, and he'd been waiting for a reason to open it. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I wasn't going anywhere and I hadn't done anything, and I didn't plan to do anything to disrupt anyone's access to that road. "Then why aren't you saying that publicly?" he asked. "Because I don't need to yet." He was quiet for a moment, then, "All right." My attorney met me in his office the following week. We sat across a conference table with the cease and desist letter between us and a yellow legal pad on my side. He explained it plain. To win prescriptive easement, the HOA needed to prove their road use had been open, continuous, and hostile. Not hostile as in aggressive. Hostile as in without the landowner's permission. If the prior owner had ever explicitly said, "You may use this road," the hostile use requirement failed. The whole theory unravels from that one word. "So," I said, "if there's a permission letter somewhere," he looked at me over his glasses, "then they don't have a case." I nodded and wrote that down too. We also had his office contact the county roads department directly. I wanted their records on the road's maintenance, transfer, the 1989 arrangement, anything filed when the county handed responsibility to the HOA. The response came back 10 days later in writing. Road maintenance had been informally transferred to Cedarwood Ridge HOA in 1998. No easement instrument had been filed with the county at the time of transfer. No formal road dedication had ever been recorded. The county's position was that the road was not a county asset and had not been since the informal handover. My attorney filed it, a small piece of paper. Quiet factual from a government office. The kind of document that carries a particular weight in a courtroom because there's no one's fingerprints on it, no agenda, no side, no stake in the outcome. Through all of this, I kept photographing. Every sign the HOA had zip-tied to my fence posts. Every HOA vehicle that drove past the southwest corner. Every board member I could identify logged by date and time. I had started a folder on the day they served me, and I added to it methodically. Carl called again the following Thursday. "People at the meeting are scared," he said. "Not because of you, because of what Margaret's telling them will happen if you win." "What does she say will happen?" "That you'll gate the road and they'll be landlocked, no access to the highway. That they'll have to use the county bypass, which adds 4 miles and goes past the transfer station." "Is she telling them what happens if she loses?" Silence. "Because that's actually the more interesting question," I said. Carl said he'd keep in touch. I believed him. I set the phone down and looked at my folder. Cease and desist letter. County Roads Response. Time-stamped photo log 17 entries. Attorney's notes. One yellow legal pad with 2 words circled at the top of the first page. Hostile use. Their attorney had used that phrase as the foundation of their claim. I had written it down because I knew, and now my attorney knew, that proving prescriptive easement in this state required meeting a very specific legal standard, a standard the HOA would need to demonstrate across 31 years of documented history without a single moment of the prior owner's permission undermining the whole structure. A standard, as it turned out, they couldn't meet. Carl picked the diner because it was 3 miles outside the subdivision boundary. He was already in the booth when I arrived, a cup of coffee in front of him and a manila folder on the table beside it. The folder was thick. Not dramatically thick, the kind of thick that comes from years of slow, quiet accumulation by someone who wasn't sure when it would matter, only that it eventually would. We shook hands. I sat down and ordered coffee. He opened the folder. "I've been keeping these since 2019, he said. "Board meeting minutes mostly, some letters, a few notices I saved when I probably should have just thrown them away." He laid the minutes across the table in chronological order, oldest first. The 2003 set was what I wanted to see. Carl had flagged the page with a post-it. I read it while he watched. The board had voted motion second all ayes to maintain and assert control over the road corridor adjacent to the subdivision's western boundary. No attorney present, no county approval sought, no title search ordered, no plat reviewed, no legal basis cited. The minutes recorded a 12-minute discussion followed by a unanimous vote. A board of 3 people sitting in someone's living room deciding they owned something they had never once verified. The board president who ran that meeting had since moved to another state. Margaret had inherited the arrangement as a fact of life, the way you inherit furniture without ever asking where it came from or whether the previous owner had actually paid for it. "She's never looked at the plate," I said. Carl shook his head. I don't think it occurred to her that there was anything to look at. He'd brought 2 families with him, though not to the diner. We met them separately at their homes, Carl making the introductions. The Hendersons were first. Dorothy, 74, Gerald, 71. Fixed income, the way that phrase means something specific. Not tight, but genuinely constrained with small margins, and no flexibility for unexpected costs. They had lived in Cedarwood Ridge for 16 years, and had accumulated $1,400 in HOA fines over the last 3. Grass height twice. An exterior paint color the shade of their front shutters that Margaret had decided no longer met community standards, despite the Hendersons having lived with those shutters for 11 years without a single complaint. A seasonal wreath left on the door 4 days past the date the HOA had apparently designated as the cutoff for such things. $1,400, under a lien threat. Dorothy set a cup of tea in front of me that I hadn't asked for and sat down across from me with her hands folded. She wasn't angry. She was tired in the specific way that comes from 3 years of fighting something that keeps finding new angles to come at you. "We're not looking for trouble," she said. "We just want this to stop." I told her I understood. I told her I wasn't going to do anything that affected her access to the road regardless of how the legal matter resolved. "That's what we're worried about," Gerald said. "Margaret's told everyone that if you win, we're all locked in." "Margaret's told everyone quite a few things," I said. I didn't push further. I asked questions, took notes, and told them their experience was relevant to what I was putting together. I didn't recruit them. People came to me because they were frightened, not because I was running anything. The Garcias were the second family. Roberto and Elena, 2 kids, a mailbox post. The post was the wrong shade of beige. Roberto had repainted it the previous spring using a color he'd matched to the HOA-approved palette within what he described as a reasonable margin of error. Margaret had measured it against a physical color swatch on her clipboard and declared it non-compliant. Fine, $200. A letter followed, then another when the fine wasn't paid immediately. A lien threat arrived in the 4th week. Roberto told me this at his kitchen table with the kind of careful, practiced calm that means someone has told the story enough times that the anger has been replaced by something flatter and more permanent. "It's a mailbox post," he said. "I know." What the Garcias understood without being told was the system's actual logic. The fines and the road were the same tool. One was visible, obvious, a road every family depended on. The other was granular, relentless, designed to remind you every few months that someone held authority over your property. Together, they kept 96 families in a particular relationship with the board. Remove one lever, and you had to wonder about the other. Carl came with me to my attorney's office the following afternoon. He brought the folder. I brought the plat. We spread the 1971 county plat map across the conference table, and my attorney walked Carl through it the same way he'd walked me through it at closing. The plat is the county's official recorded map of how land has been legally divided. Every parcel, every boundary, every easement notation drawn to scale and filed with the county recorder. This one went back to 1971. Carl leaned over it while my attorney traced the lines with a pen. He found the Cedarwood Ridge subdivision first, eastern portion of the plat, boundary lines clearly marked. Then he moved the pen left-west to where the road ran. The HOA's western boundary ended 60 feet east of the road's center line. Clean line north to south, no ambiguity. The road corridor sat entirely to the west of it, entirely within my parcel. I'd known this since closing. Seeing it on the table in front of Carl, watching him trace it himself, made it something different, more real, more final. My attorney set his pen down. The plat alone wins ownership. The question is still the prescriptive easement argument. 31 years of use maintained and open, they'll push that angle hard. He was right. The plat proved I owned the corridor. It didn't automatically extinguish a prescriptive claim if the HOA could demonstrate all the required elements, including hostile use, including the absence of permission. Carl reached into the folder. He hadn't mentioned this part. He set a single photocopied letter on top of the plat map. I read the date first, 1994. Then the letterhead, the farm estate, the family name I'd seen on my own chain of title. Then the body. 2 sentences addressed to the Cedarwood Ridge HOA predecessor board. You may continue using the road as you have been with my permission provided you maintain it. Dated, signed by the estate's then managing heir. The word permission was right there in the middle of the second line. My attorney picked it up, read it once, set it down, looked at Carl. Where did you get this? I found it in the community files, Carl said. When I was on the records committee in 2011, I made a copy. I didn't know why at the time, I just thought someone should have this. Prescriptive easement requires hostile use, adverse use without the landowner's permission. This letter was written permission from the prior landowner to the HOA in 1994. 11 years into the 31-year window the HOA's entire legal theory depended on. The HOA's attorney had built his case on the assumption that no such document existed. It existed. It had been sitting in Carl's folder for 13 years. The HOA didn't know, and they were going to find out in a courtroom. The amended complaint arrived on a Tuesday. My attorney called before I'd finished reading it. He didn't say hello. Did you get it? I'm reading it now. Keep going, 3rd page. I turned to the 3rd page. The new demand was there in plain language formatted like something routine. The court should declare and grant Cedarwood Ridge HOA a permanent express easement over the road corridor as part of the case's final resolution. Not just validate an existing right, grant a new one, permanently, through the court. I read it twice. They want the judge to hand them the easement, I said. They do. What does that require? Full title chain examination, every deed, every transaction, every recorded instrument touching that corridor going back to the original subdivision. The court has to look at everything before it can grant something like this. A pause. Everything, including documents the HOA's attorney doesn't know exist yet. I set the complaint down on the kitchen table. They just opened the door, I said. That's one way to put it. Margaret's logic, as best I understood it, the original prescriptive easement argument was fragile. It could unravel from a single contrary document. The amended complaint was meant to be stronger, ask the court to simply grant a permanent easement as a matter of necessity. 96 families, 1 road, surely a judge would see that. What she didn't understand was the cost of that ask. Requesting a court-granted easement means inviting the judge to examine the complete chain of title for that corridor. Every deed going back to 1971, every recorded instrument and every conspicuous absence of one, the 1971 plat, the 1994 permission letter, my property tax records showing I'd been paying taxes on the road corridor since closing clean, uncontested, no competing interest anywhere in the chain. All of it was now going in front of a judge. I called my attorney back that afternoon and told him to start organizing. Court date 60 days. I found out about Margaret's second move from Carl, who had been attending every community meeting since we'd first spoken. She stood at the front of the room and told Cedarwood Ridge homeowners the lawsuit was progressing well, that the amended complaint was a stronger position, that the court would affirm the HOA's historical rights to the road, and this would all be resolved permanently in the community's favor. Carl sat in the back row. He told me later there were a few neighbors who looked uncertain, not convinced exactly, but not ready to ask questions out loud either. Margaret has a particular way of projecting confidence that functions as a substitute for evidence. I've seen the type. They hold the room until the room gets a reason not to let them. She also made a third move, one she apparently didn't mention at the community meeting. She sent a letter to the county. It suggested that the road had unresolved ownership complications and proposed that my development permits I had filed for a farm infrastructure permit on the northern portion of the parcel should be reviewed pending resolution of the legal matter. It was a reasonable tactic in theory: tie up my permits, create pressure, make me feel the cost of waiting. My attorney filed a response with the county within the week. The county declined to pause the permits. Their position was that a civil dispute between private parties over a road corridor had no bearing on a separate infrastructure application on a different portion of the property. The county's letter went into my folder. I kept working the land through all of it. Not because everything was fine, because stopping would have signaled something I had no intention of signaling. I worked the northern fields. I walked the woodlot. I repaired a section of fence on the eastern boundary that had nothing to do with the road or the lawsuit or any of it. Every few days, a board member's vehicle would slow near the southwest corner. Sometimes they photographed the road from the county highway. Sometimes they drove through using it the way they always had because I had never done anything to stop them. I photographed them back. The time-stamped log I'd started on the day of service was complete now. Every HOA vehicle, every board member I could identify, every date and time they had been on or adjacent to my land without permission. 41 entries, organized and labeled. My attorney had a copy. I drove out to see the Hendersons on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks before the court date. Dorothy answered the door. Gerald was in the back putting in a garden, which seemed like an optimistic thing to be doing in the middle of all this, and I told him so. He said someone had to. I sat with them for about 40 minutes. I told them what I could, that the case was in good shape, that I believed the documents would speak for themselves, that I was confident about the outcome. I did not make promises I couldn't guarantee, because I've learned what those cost when things go sideways. But I told them clearly, directly looking at both of them. Whatever the court decided, whatever happened in that room, I was not going to gate that road. I was not going to cut off their access unilaterally. I was not going to use the outcome as leverage against the people who had nothing to do with the decision to file this lawsuit. I wanted this resolved legally, cleanly, and permanently, for everyone. Dorothy nodded. Gerald said thank you. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It didn't need to be. I drove home along the county road past the southwest corner of my parcel, past the fence posts with Margaret's signs still zip-tied to them. The road was empty in the late afternoon light. Quiet. Just pavement and fence line, and 60 days until a judge would open every document anyone had ever filed about that strip of ground. I thought about Margaret's attorney standing in front of that judge. I thought about the third page of the amended complaint. I thought about what it means to ask a court to examine something you've never examined yourself. When their attorney filed that amended complaint, asking the court to grant them a permanent easement, my attorney looked at me across the table and said 4 words. They just opened the door. He was right, and in 60 days we were going to walk through it. The county civil court was a small room. Not intimidating small, functional small. 2 tables facing a raised bench, a gallery of padded chairs behind a low, partition fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly more tired than they were. The kind of room where unremarkable things happen most days, and occasionally something that matters. This was going to be one of the ones that mattered. I arrived early with my attorney. We set our materials on the defense table and did not spread them out. 1 manila folder closed, 1 legal pad blank side up. That was all anyone could see from the other side of the room. Margaret arrived 9 minutes later with 2 board members I recognized from the day of service. They took seats in the gallery directly behind the plaintiff's table, where HOA's attorney was already organizing a stack of documents that reached about 4 inches high. Maintenance records. Mostly I could see the tabs from where I sat. 22 years of repaving invoices, snow removal contracts, road condition photographs. It was a real case. I want to be clear about that. Their attorney had prepared seriously, and the documents were genuine. 31 years of a community maintaining a road, paying for it, depending on it. That story was true. It just wasn't the only story in the room. Carl came in with the Hendersons and 2 other Cedarwood Ridge residents I didn't know by name. They sat in the middle of the gallery, not behind either table. That placement felt deliberate. Carl nodded at me once. Dorothy Henderson held her purse in her lap with both hands. Gerald looked straight ahead. The judge entered. We stood. She settled at the bench, reviewed the case file for a moment, and indicated HOA's attorney could proceed. He was good. That's the honest assessment. He opened by telling the story the way Margaret had been telling it for months, but calmly, professionally, with citations. 31 years of continuous road use. HOA-funded maintenance going back to the early 90s. 96 families with no alternative access route. He laid it out as a matter of community necessity and established practice, and he submitted the maintenance records as supporting evidence organized by year tabbed indexed. The judge reviewed them without expression. She flipped through, slowly pausing on a few pages. The maintenance expenditures were consistent. The road condition photographs showed a well-kept surface across 2 decades. The snow removal contracts were signed and dated. Whatever else was true, the HOA had maintained that road and the records showed it clearly. In the gallery behind the plaintiff's table, one of the Cedarwood Ridge residents I didn't know leaned toward the other and exchanged a look, a quiet exhale, the kind that happens when something you've been worrying about starts to look manageable. Margaret allowed herself a small nod. HOA's attorney continued. He shifted from the maintenance records to framing, and this is where the argument became something other than just documentation. Your Honor, my client's community has maintained and depended on this road for 31 years. The defendant purchased adjacent land less than a year ago and immediately became a disruptive presence. We are asking this court to protect a community's established way of life against the actions of a newcomer who purchased land with no apparent regard for the people whose daily lives depend on access to that road. The word newcomer was doing specific work. It positioned me as opportunistic marginal, a variable introduced into a stable situation I had no real stake in. It was a reasonable narrative choice given what he knew. Given what he didn't know, it would age poorly. I didn't look at Margaret. I kept my eyes on the bench. The judge set down the maintenance records. She looked at HOA's attorney over the top of her reading glasses. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. Counsel, before we continue, was this use ever permissive? HOA's attorney paused. Your Honor, the road use. Was there any evidence that the prior landowner explicitly authorized the HOA's use of the road at any point during the 31-year period? She was already thinking about the hostile use requirement. She'd read the pleadings before she walked into the room. I'd expected that, and she'd identified the same vulnerability my attorney had identified on the day I forwarded the cease and desist. HOA's attorney collected himself. He answered without hesitation. Your Honor, we have found no such permission agreement. The use was adverse from inception. The HOA has used this road openly, continuously, and without the consent of any prior landowner, which establishes the hostile use element required under the statute. He said it with complete confidence. He said it because as far as he knew, it was true. He had no idea a letter existed that began with the words, "You may continue using the road as you have been with my permission." He had just told a judge in open court on the public record that no such document existed. I kept my face neutral. My attorney slid the legal pad across the table toward me 1 inch. I looked down. One word written in the center of the page. Ready. I didn't write anything back. I didn't need to. In the gallery, Carl had stopped watching the bench. He was watching our table, the closed manila folder sitting beside my attorney's hand. Dorothy Henderson had set her purse on the floor. Gerald was very still. HOA's attorney finished his presentation. He organized his documents with practiced efficiency and sat down with the posture of a man who had just made his opponent's position very difficult. His case was logical. His records were real. His argument was coherent. He was also missing the one document that made all of it irrelevant. The judge turned to our side of the room. Counsel, you may proceed. My attorney opened the manila folder and set a single document on the table, face up, flat. I had seen it before. Their attorney had not. My attorney stood up. He didn't rush. He picked up the 1971 county plat map, walked to the bench, and requested it be entered as Exhibit 1. The judge accepted it. He placed a copy on the plaintiff's table, then returned to his position, and began. Your Honor, this is the county plat of record for the Southwest Quadrant, originally filed in 1971 and updated through the current date. Every parcel in this area is mapped and bounded by this document. I'd like to direct the court's attention to the Southwest Corridor. He described it the way he described it to Carl and me at the conference table. The HOA boundary line, the road corridor, the 60 feet of separation between where Cedarwood Ridge's jurisdiction ended and where the pavement ran. The judge examined the plat. She traced the lines herself, pen in hand, not writing, just following. It took her about 45 seconds. She looked up at HOA's attorney. Counsel, is this the county plat of record for this area? He had a copy in front of him now. He reviewed it. He could not dispute a county document any more than he could dispute a birth certificate. What the plat showed was what the plat showed. Your Honor, regardless of the plat, prescriptive easement rights can exist on property the claimant does not own. The ownership question is separate from the use rights question. Agreed, the judge said. Which returns us to the question I raised earlier, whether the use was adverse or permissive. She looked at him steadily. He had answered that question 40 minutes ago. His answer was on the record. My attorney reached into the manila folder. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit 2. He walked a copy to the bench, walked a second copy to the plaintiff's table, and set it in front of HOA's attorney without comment. I watched HOA's attorney pick it up. He read the letterhead first, then the date 1994, then the body. He read it again. The room was very quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed. Someone in the gallery shifted in their seat and then went still as if sound itself had become inappropriate. The judge read her copy. Then she read it aloud into the record, in the flat, careful voice of someone who understands that certain moments require precision. You may continue using the road as you have been with my permission provided you maintain it. She set the letter down. HOA's attorney was still holding his copy. He wasn't reading it anymore. He was looking at the table in front of him at a fixed point that had no particular significance except that it was somewhere to look. Counsel, the judge said. He set the letter down. Your Honor, may I request a brief recess? 5 minutes. Margaret's face in the recess was the color of old concrete. She leaned forward in her gallery seat and spoke in a low, tight voice to the back of her attorney's head. I couldn't hear what she said. I didn't need to. The body language was its own complete sentence. Carl was watching her, not with satisfaction, with the specific attention of someone who has waited a long time for a thing to happen and is now noting carefully that it has happened. Dorothy Henderson reached over and took Gerald's hand. She didn't say anything. She just held it. I sat at the defense table and looked at the 1994 letter still visible on the bench and thought about the farm family who had written it. A practical letter written without drama about a practical arrangement. You may continue using the road as you have been, with my permission, provided you maintain it. 2 sentences, dated, signed, filed in a community folder, and saved for 13 years by a retired civil engineer who thought someone should have it. 31 years of assumed rights, 1 letter, 1 word, permission. The judge reconvened after 5 minutes. HOA's attorney stood. He had reorganized. His voice was professionally steady, which I respected because the ground under his case had just dissolved and he was still standing on it. Your Honor, even if the court finds the 1994 letter undermines the prescriptive easement claim, we would argue the court should grant an easement by necessity. 96 families. 1 access road, no viable alternative route. The doctrine of necessity exists precisely for situations like this. The judge nodded slowly. I'm aware of the doctrine, she said. I'd also note that easement by necessity was not the claim filed in this case. It was not in the original complaint, and it was not in the amended complaint. What the amended complaint asked this court to do was examine the full chain of title and grant a permanent express easement based on established rights. She paused. We've examined the title chain. The court has found no established rights of the type claimed. She looked at him over her glasses. A necessity argument raised for the first time during closing statements after the primary theory has failed is not a theory. It's a position. HOA's attorney sat down. My attorney introduced Exhibit 3, the full chain of title from 1971 to my current deed. Road corridor included in every transaction, no easement notation, no competing instrument, clean and uncontested from the original plat forward. Then Exhibit 4, 41 time-stamped photographs. HOA board members on my land placing signs on my fence posts on the day I was served without permission. The judge reviewed them without comment, then entered them into the record. She looked at her notes. She looked at both tables. Then she began. The HOA had not established prescriptive easement. The 1994 letter from the prior landowner constituted explicit written permission for the HOA's road use, and permission by definition was the opposite of the hostile adverse use the statute required. The hostile use element, without which the claim could not stand, was absent, not weakened, absent. The amended demand for a court-granted permanent easement was denied. The road corridor belonged to my parcel per the 1971 plat of record. The HOA's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. She set her pen down. I'll also note that this court has reviewed the circumstances under which this litigation was initiated. A title examination of the kind that would have revealed both the plat boundaries and the 1994 permission letter was available to the plaintiff prior to filing. The decision to proceed without that examination and to amend the complaint to demand a permanent court-granted easement requiring the full title review that disclosed the documents undermining the original claim does not reflect the standard of diligence this court expects. Attorney's fees are awarded to the defendant. She closed her folder. We're adjourned. The room moved in pieces. Margaret stood and walked out without looking at anyone. Not her attorney, not the board members behind her, not the gallery. She moved quickly the way people move when they are trying to be somewhere else before their face gives them away. Her attorney gathered his documents with the careful, unhurried movements of a professional who has lost before and knows better than to make it worse with visible distress. He would deal with the debrief later. Right now he was just packing a bag. In the gallery, The two Cedarwood Ridge residents I didn't know by name looked at each other. One of them said something I couldn't hear. Neither followed Margaret out. Carl stood up. He walked to my attorney's side of the table and shook his hand. Then mine. He didn't say much. Something brief, understated, the kind of thing you say when the right outcome has occurred and there's nothing useful to add to it. Dorothy Henderson stood up slowly, the way you do when you've been sitting somewhere stressful for a long time, and your body reminds you of that all at once. Gerald put his hand on her back. She looked at me across the low partition. "Thank you," she said. I told her she was welcome. I told her this wasn't over yet. There was still paperwork, still the formal order, still the fee process. She nodded. She understood. But her hands weren't clasped anymore, and the set of her shoulders was different from when she'd walked in. I stayed at the table while the room emptied. My attorney was making notes. I looked at the bench, empty now, judge gone, and at Exhibit 2, still on the record, waiting to be formally filed. "You may continue using the road as you have been with my permission." They had built 31 years on a foundation no one had checked. Carl had checked, and that had made all the difference. The court order was filed with the county recorder's office 11 days after the ruling. One document, 2 pages. My title to the road corridor confirmed in the public record the HOA's claim, extinguished the case, closed with prejudice. HOA's attorney sent a letter acknowledging the dismissal. 3 sentences. Professional, no appeal. It was over. The $28,000 attorney's fee award was a different kind of problem for Margaret, not a legal problem, but a practical one with an audience. The HOA's operating fund didn't carry that kind of balance. To pay it, the board would need to pass a special assessment, roughly $291 per household, levied against all 96 families in Cedarwood Ridge, every family, including the ones who had nothing to do with the decision to file the lawsuit, including the Hendersons, including the Garcias. Margaret called the meeting herself. I don't know what she told people in advance. I only know what Carl told me afterward. She stood at the front of the community room, the same room where she had described me as an outside land speculator threatening the neighborhood, and began explaining the assessment, the legal outcome, the fees, the timeline for payment. Carl was in the front row. He raised his hand. Margaret acknowledged him. "Could you read the judge's ruling?" he said. "The section about why the fees were awarded. I want to make sure everyone understands what happened." Margaret did not read the judge's ruling. She did not finish the meeting either. Her resignation letter was submitted 9 days later. 2 other board members filed theirs within the week. The HOA hadn't held a contested board election in 9 years. 3 seats had been filled by appointment for the last 2 cycles. Margaret's appointments people she had selected herself. This election had 7 candidates for 3 seats. Carl won his seat with the largest vote share. He called me the evening the results were announced, more to report than to celebrate. That was consistent with everything I knew about him. The new board's first formal agenda item. Item 1 at their inaugural meeting was a full audit of outstanding fines and liens under the previous administration. Every fine issued for subjective violations, every lien threat sent without proper board review, every penalty accumulated against homeowners who had no meaningful way to appeal. The Hendersons' $1,400 balance was cleared in full. Written notice sent. The lien threat formally withdrawn from the county record. The Garcia family's mailbox, fined $200 for a shade of beige that fell outside Margaret's personal margin of tolerance, was reversed. Their file closed. The board issued written apologies to both families. Not a form letter. Carl told me later he'd written them himself, one at a time. A 90-day moratorium on new fines was put in place while the board undertook a full bylaw review. Grass Heights paint colors, vehicle compliance. Everything Margaret had used as currency for 11 years was being examined by people who intended to use it as policy instead. 3 weeks after the election, my attorney reached out to the new board with a proposal. I would formally record a permanent access easement for the road corridor at no cost to the HOA, no cost to any homeowner. Free, clean, permanent. Filed with the county on the record, exactly the kind of documented legal right the road had never actually had. 3 conditions. First, the corridor remained exactly as platted, same dimensions, same alignment, no alterations without my written consent. Second, I retained the right to gate the farm track on the northern portion of my acreage, which had nothing to do with the subdivision's access and never had. Third, a written acknowledgement would be recorded alongside the easement stating that the road corridor sat on private property held by me and that the easement was granted voluntarily by the landowner. Not adversarially, not as a trophy, just accurately. The new board signed within 10 days. 96 families now had secure, legal documented road access. For the first time in 31 years, the right they had always assumed was real was actually real. And they knew now whose land they were on. I didn't buy 1,200 acres to fight with a homeowners association. I bought it to work it. The fields, the woodlot, the service track on the northern end, the quiet of a large piece of land at the edge of a county that was changing around it. That's what I was after when I bid at that auction, and that's what I have now undisturbed, clear in every document that matters, belonging to no one except me and the county recorder's office. The people in those 96 homes didn't deserve to be held hostage to a board's assumption. They'd been driving that road twice a day for decades, maintaining it, depending on it, living their lives around it, and none of that was their fault. They weren't the ones who filed the lawsuit. They weren't the ones who never checked the plat. They're not hostages anymore. Carl called on a Thursday evening about 2 weeks after the easement was recorded. The new board took down the signs, he said. I knew which signs he meant. I drove out the next morning, early before the commuter traffic started moving through the corridor. The southwest corner of my parcel, the fence line, the posts where Margaret's team had zip-tied their laminated notices on the morning they served me. HOA easement road, no interference. The posts were bare, clean wood showing through where the ties had been cut. No paper, no laminate, no declaration of rights that had never existed. The road was empty in the early morning light. I got out of the truck and stood at the fence line for a moment. Then I walked back, opened the passenger door, and pulled the plat map from the glove box. Unfolded it across the hood, found the southwest corner, found the road corridor, found the HOA boundary line 60 feet east, exactly where it had always been. I folded it back up, put it in the glove box, got in the truck, and drove home across my own land. They built 31 years of assumed rights on a foundation no one ever checked. I checked, and that made all the difference.